This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
It's really interesting to me that Tocqueville's classic work is entitled Democracy in America. And we have a lot of people in our day who are very worried about democracy and who want to be sure that democracy flourishes. And yet, the thing that is so interesting about Tocqueville's work is that he talks about it, not with a Washington centered view of the world, but celebrating kind of the American spirit that is born out in small towns and rural communities and other places where people come together, and when they see a need, they find a solution to it that often means they, each contribute their own gifts or skills or resources. And then you see, talking about, a smart person in a big place, Robert Putnam, up in Boston back in the 90s began lamenting, the fact that we had become a nation of people who bowl alone, and there has been a significant decline in this sort of civic activity, and how it is very much the root of a lot of our problems in preserving and continuing a democracy that works well.
The Village Square, a nervy bunch of liberals and conservatives who believe that disagreement and dialogue make for a good conversation, a good country, and a good time. At the Village Square, we talk about politics, religion, and race. You know, the topics your mom taught you never to discuss in polite company. Listen, at the Village Square, we make pigs fly.
Hey folks, welcome to Village Squarecast. This is Corey Nathan, so glad to be with you again. Thank you for joining us for an introduction to the Flying Pig Academy. Location, location, location. The importance of being earnest. Local. The importance of being local. Funding for this program was provided through a grant from the Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Check out Florida Humanities online at floridahumanities.org. In this conversation, we're joined by Liz Joyner, of course, our founder and CEO, and Bill Maddox, former board chair of the Village Square and senior director of the J. Stanley Marshall Center for Education Freedom at the James Madison Institute. Liz and Bill dig into a longtime dream of the organization, and that is to start the Flying Pig Academy. What is that, you may ask? Well, you'll find out. There are definitely some great topics they dive into here, like the importance of local community engagement, like what's up with the whole flying pig motif? Love that. And they share insights on bridge building efforts at the local level. Some good stuff. So, with that, I'll turn it over to Liz and Bill, and I'll drop back in after they wrap up. Enjoy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Liz Joyner. I'm founder and president of the Village Square. And I am delighted to welcome you today to Village Squarecast. And today we're going to be introducing a new concept at the Village Square. It's kind of a new old concept called Flying Pig Academy. And our topic today is going to be location, 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 or just how important it is to be local. And I'm very excited to introduce our former board chair and my colleague and friend, Bill Maddox. Bill is the senior director at James Madison Institute. He's the J. Stanley Marshall Center for Educational Freedom. Bill, welcome.
Hey, thank you. Delighted to be here.
Uh, so you and I have been walking a walk for a pretty long time here, imagining something that we are now launching called the Flying Pig Academy. What in the world is the Flying Pig Academy?
Well, I mean, this is really kind of a takeoff on the mascot that the Village Square has used for years, which was, I know, your brainchild. The flying pig, the old adage that, such and such will never happen until pigs fly. Well, in a lot of ways, the vision of the Village Square from its outset, as you as you've kind of demonstrated, is that we believe sometimes conversations and cooperation and goodwill that seems impossible at times uh, from afar or from outsiders can actually take place, especially when it takes place in localities among people who are rubbing shoulders as neighbors and as community members, as and in time as friends. And so yeah, the Flying Pig has been the mascot for the Village Square for many years, and the Flying Pig Academy is, I guess, a way for us to share with others, perhaps especially those outside our community, some of the things that we've learned along the way so that they can learn from mistakes we've made, but also I think from the things that we've learned and figured out about how to go about doing some of this kind of bridge building work.
And so here we are. I'm actually looking around because I almost always have a flying pig within reach, but for some reason I don't really have one right now. People over the years, because of our mascot, people bring us things. So that includes like hand-blown flying pigs. We have a flying pig weather vane. We have salt and pepper shakers, Christmas
Mm.
tree ornaments, and a little thing that's got legs, and you go zoom, 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 and then the pig will like go by itself. So it's quite a collection. But you know, in some ways, actually, the fact that people bring us those pigs is maybe a little bit of a good metaphor for what we're going to talk about today, which is just how important it is to be doing work that builds bridges across divisions in hometowns. And we've been doing this for 18 years, and it's been a very weird life experience to see the national conversation, the national politics just getting worse and worse and worse. And I mean, my experience has been that I regularly talk to people and say, you really should look at what happens in a hometown when you gather
Mm.
people who don't look or think alike. It's way easier, and kind of a whole different animal.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And as I've thought about this over the years, I think a big key to this idea is that everybody cares about the place they live in and wants to see it thrive. They want to live in a place that is, that you're proud of and that you feel like is not only a good place to live, but is even getting better. And so if that's true, and I don't think that's true of only people on the left or only people on the right or only people in the middle. I think it's true across the board. And so one of the things that bridge builders at the local level have going for them is the ability to kind of leverage this interest that people have in, living in a great place, um, to their advantage. When you're trying to have a national conversation or even a statewide conversation, it becomes a lot harder for those sorts of conversations to really gain traction because at the end of the day, everybody goes back to their respective localities and lives life on a day-to-day basis apart from those people that just gathered at the national gathering or at the statewide gathering or whatever it is. And so that's
Yeah,
not to
yeah.
say that it's not to say that gatherings of at those levels are completely unimportant. It just simply means that tackling this problem from the bottom up, beginning at the village level, makes an awful lot of sense.
So one of the first things I ever read that you wrote, it was a piece called Keep Austin Weird. And it's become a go-to concept in the Village Square since I read it all those years ago. But say something about how, I mean, that was many, many moons ago that you wrote that, right? And
It was many moons ago, and the piece was inspired by the Keep Austin Weird campaign because I had just spent some time in Austin and just I I I I have a peculiar affection for people who are might be considered weird. I find it refreshing to encounter people who enjoy who they are and don't feel like they need to be overly concerned about conforming to what other people think they should be. And so even though there's an awful lot that goes on in Austin and elsewhere among people who are weird that I might find weird, nevertheless, I have an affection for those who, kind of revel in it and are proud of it and don't mind being nonconformist. So anyway, I was actually writing a piece. The article that you're referring to was actually entitled "Keep America Weird," and I was trying to make a case for being more willing to give room for people who have different points of view, respect and an opportunity to participate in national conversations and all the rest. But it was very much kind of in that same spirit. That's very much the spirit that I think we embrace. It's not that we're trying to celebrate weirdness at the Village Square so much as we are wanting to give communities an opportunity to have ownership of, what their community is going to be like, and wanting to create a space for people whose views might be considered outside the mainstream, um, an opportunity to kind of make their case and to be heard and to be given a chance to speak. And one of the things that I'm very mindful of in this context is that I'm a huge MLK fan. And I remember reading once about some polling data that was done, I want to say in 1966. So this was after his, letter from a Birmingham jail and I Have a Dream speech and Nobel Prize and all the rest. And it was like a public approval rating, poll on kind of his public approval rating. And he was in negative territory. He was viewed even then less favorably than more favorably by most Americans. And if you go back 5 or 10 years before that, his numbers were far worse. He was indeed a pariah. And so there's a part of me that's like, sometimes it's important for us to hear from people who might be considered unpopular or outside the mainstream or whatever it might be, because they have messages that, if made well and if they have merit, will in time hopefully carry the day. And we will see that we were wise to listen to folks that might otherwise have been dismissed. So that's part of the reason why I embrace the idea of keep Austin weird, at least in that sense.
So that's actually, you mentioned another of the principles that we've adopted at the Village Square, thanks to your thinking on this, and that is that we are pariah friendly. And the thing that's interesting, I do think it's so easy in the space to sort of think that no, we don't want the person who goes to the city commission meeting and yells at them. But in some ways, what we've learned is that those are people who care and who are frustrated. And if you invite them into a space where they are connected to people in their community, that it changes that. We've got a great picture that we really enjoyed of one of our local pariah humans at a Village Square event, grinning ear to ear, that ran on the on the front page of the newspaper after an event we did. And it really does change everything if you are operating inside of a community between people. And actually, it makes me think of another thing, and you can comment on either one of those, pariah friendly, or just the idea that you mentioned Dr. King. I also he is my lifelong hero, and that's something that you and I share together. And we've done lots of programs here locally on race-related issues and celebrating the history of our civil rights movement. You were on a sidewalk commission that commemorated the 50th anniversary of our lunch counter sit-ins. And I think that that also, yet you work for a think tank, James Madison Institute, that probably if people asked would say it has a conservative lean to it. And so if I didn't know you, I wouldn't know the complexity and the richness of who Bill Maddox is, and that it's, in really polarizing times, one of the primary forces is that we make everybody two-dimensional. People who aren't two-dimensional at
Right.
all. And so it's almost like I don't know, reconstitute, add water. When you take this back to a community level, all of a sudden you can see people in their incredible complexity, and it makes it impossible to categorize them in one dimension. Are
No,
you us
that's
or are you them?
yeah, no, that's really good. And this plays out in more than just um kind of politics or in the bridge building work that we did. Um and some of this is just a reflection of differences of communities of different sizes. And so, at some point we may want to devote a conversation to that topic alone, just like we might want to devote one to the concept of being pariah friendly, because there's an awful lot in both of those areas. But here's what I would say is, prior to coming to Tallahassee some, I guess, 18 years or so ago now, I lived in Washington, D.C. And one of my frustrations, I was living there toward the end of my time in D.C. in the suburbs. And one of the frustrations that I had with that life was that I didn't feel like I really knew whole people, which is to say, there was a group of people that I, worked with downtown that came from all parts of the greater metropolitan area. And I saw in a work context, but I never saw them in any other context. I never met their wives or children or families or, saw other aspects of them. And then likewise, when I returned to my suburban community, after work, the weekends and evenings were spent with a completely different set of people that I did kind of the rest of life with in some way, but I never saw in a work setting. And it was just weird. I kind of felt like I know this part of this person and that part of another person. But one of the things that I really loved about Tallahassee is that it's very common for me to go to out to lunch with someone at work and run into someone that I know, from my church or from my kids' little league program, or from Young Actors Theater where my kids did drama and stuff, and to then go to a show. I think this is where you and I met. In fact, was at Young Actors. I'll go to a show there and I'll run into someone I know from work, and this sort of thing happens all the time. And I think it gives us in a town like this an opportunity to kind of know people in a multidimensional way, and to see aspects of them that we can relate to, even if there are things about them that we don't share in common. And I think that helps when it comes to bridge building, because it becomes harder to just write people off because you don't agree with them politically, because you actually have other things in common with them that and remember from your time, serving on the, committee at school or whatever it was that brought you together.
And I think that people don't really that that sounds so logical and rational and important, but I think people really underplay the importance of those relationships across differences, the cross-cutting relationships, where I disagree with you vehemently on this or that, and we're on opposite sides of the political spectrum, but our kids play softball together, and I really appreciate this other thing about you. And even when you take this up to a national scale, that's really one of the things that's changed so profoundly in civic life, is that Congress goes home on the weekends, that they don't move their families to DC. And it used to be that they would disagree with each other on the floor of Congress, and then they'd go to each other's daughters' weddings over the weekend. And that formed that sort of basis of relationships that can withstand difference of opinion, and that sees people as real people, on the other side of that. To my way of thinking, that's our real problem. The problem isn't that we disagree on politics, because in a democratic republic of 330 million people, we're gonna disagree on politics. That's a feature, not a bug. And but the thing that we don't do is we don't see each other as humans with good intentions, and who might have a good idea or two, even if, we disagree on something else.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair, and I think there is a lot of truth to that. I mean, there's a criticism that would be made, perhaps especially on the right, that um, sometimes things can get too convivial, and you end up with a uni party, as some would say, if everybody gets along and cares more about being a member of the club, the Senate club or something, rather than representing the interests of the people back home. But no, your point, your larger point is well taken, and you can point to friendships like that Tip O'Neill had with Ronald Reagan back when I first went to Washington, that were, I think, models for everyone, that said, hey, these people are obviously coming at issues from very different points of view, but there's a warmth to their friendship that is genuine and that is important and that sets the tone for the debates and discussions that they have about policy. And it's a shame that we've lost that, but I think it's the kind of thing that we can recover, especially if we remember. Boy, this was kind of a fun turn. If we remember Tip O'Neill's famous statement that all politics is local, because in a certain sense, what he was getting at was that people like him needed to represent the interests of the people back home. And what we're trying to say is, yeah, we think being mindful of what's happening at home, close to where you live, is the place where we all ought to be focused.
Yeah, yeah. So you had just shared, Florida Politics did a feature piece on you and your wife, Jill, which was just wonderful. And you had shared it. I wanted to pick out a quote and read it back to you that I thought was great. Um, it was, you're talking about how you had complained about the lack of sense of community where you were living, which is in the DC suburbs, which is also where I grew up. Um, and the quote is, "It was just kind of a nondescript suburban community, and I remember at one point I said to Jill, I need a mayor and a Christmas parade and a civic club." And so, maybe my question for you on that is, A, the observation that did you find that? And then B, I kind of wonder if, having grown up in that exact, 15 miles down the road from what you're describing, in a suburb of DC, which I just loved growing up there. But I sometimes wonder if the people in the big hub cities of America, where a lot of the movers and shakers are, like would just by naturally kind of have a hard time understanding why what we're talking about really is the answer to what ails us, because it's just a very different existence that you're in.
It is, and there's a lot to be said. I loved my time, especially when we were living in DC. There were a lot of things to be said about life in the big city, so to speak.
Oh, yes. Actually, to interrupt you, I love DC. So I think it's the best city on the planet,
It's a
and
well,
and I
it's a
would love to live there part-time, but it's just a different kind of community.
Yeah, and I think some of that is the nature of DC and the kind of industry that it revolves around. Um, some of its size and just the challenges that larger, more anonymous sorts of places have to smaller places, and there are downsides certainly to small town life, which I think you could point to any number of things in literature and whatnot that would identify those sorts of things. Tallahassee is kind of somewhere in between, and I think maybe that's part of why I like it so much, is because it's big enough that there's enough going on here that it doesn't feel stagnant, and everybody isn't always in each other's business, but it's small enough that it does feel intimate and manageable. It's in some ways it's kind of a city that's kind of at a human scale, in a way
Hmm.
that, and where the buildings are at a human scale in a way that a lot of big cities you don't have. But I think some of the reason why there is a tendency for people in New York or DC or other places to kind of um, not be as quick to see the wisdom of building from the bottom up from communities like ours is because they're accustomed to being in the center of the action, and they're accustomed to having people tell them and having and to telling themselves that, hey, the people that are at the top of the pyramid should really, they have the most knowledge, the best insight. We're the smart people. We ought to be the ones who give direction to this movement, to this cause, to this effort. And that's all very well meaning. And there are often insights and thoughts that folks from on high, drawing on research or other things, have that contribute greatly to efforts like the bridge building work that we're involved in. But a lot of this is really, best done kind of from the bottom up. And in some respects, it's really interesting to me that Tocqueville's classic work is entitled Democracy in America. And we have a lot of people in our day who are very worried about democracy and who want to be sure that democracy flourishes. And yet, the thing that is so interesting about Tocqueville's work is that he talks about it, not with a Washington-centered view of the world, but celebrating kind of the American spirit that is born out in small towns and, rural communities and other places where people come together, and when they see a need, they, find a solution to it that often means they, each contribute their own gifts or skills or resources. And, in his day, it was barn raising and, all sorts of other activities, building schools and newspapers and charitable organizations and all the rest. And then you see, talking about, a smart person in a big place, Robert Putnam, up in Boston back in the 90s began lamenting, the fact that we had become a nation of people who bowl alone, and there has been a significant decline in this sort of civic activity, and how it is very much the root of a lot of our problems in kind of preserving and continuing a democracy that works well. And so I think, you can look at those two, scholars, both Putnam and Tocqueville, and I think come away with an appreciation for associations at the local level that are key to helping to build the kind of trust and goodwill that ends up leading to better political conversations and debates and solutions. And so I think it's not at all an accident that this enterprise that you began, the Village Square, is rooted in a village and has a very village mentality.
It's, I often think of, we had the pleasure of having Dr. Robert Putnam and his co-author Shaylin Romney Garrett on of the book, The Upswing, on our Village Square programming, on the Unum series, and on the podcast last fall. And I think that he must be such a frustrated man. He doesn't let on at all, but he has been right about this devastating problem for such a long time, and he's been patiently telling us
Mm.
and telling us again. And one of the things that in the book The Upswing, Shaylin and Bob, I now I'm going to ask someone to put on my tombstone that Robert Putnam said I could call him Bob. One of my life achievements. But Bob and Shaylin talked about um, sort of a metaphor that they looked back in history and sort of said, when did we see this problem before? And what did we do to get out of it? And they described it as what they started seeing is like a flock of birds that was all kind of all sorts of things were moving in the same direction. All of a sudden, it just like went boom. So then they started to sort of try to pull out what it is that started moving. And what moved is that people showed up in their community. I mean, that if you were to boil it down to one thing, it would be that they showed up to get things done together inside of their communities. And that then, that then created the dynamics that we talk about all the time, which is that positive contact and superordinate goals, common shared goals. So they don't have to be political. They can be, building, they can be, a soup kitchen. They can be building a community center together, stringing Christmas lights. And those, that when you have that kind of contact, that it starts happening in your community and it just starts moving things. And then as a side benefit, because there's a lot of talk about how lonely we are today and how so much that's driving so much of the anger and the crime is loneliness. You're all of a sudden not lonely anymore if you're doing something together side by side with people in your hometown, and then what their politics are. And this is something that's sort of been true for the journey that I've walked, these many years. So many people that I love and care for now are politically very different than me. And it's not that we like, my friend Jacob Hess, we were in a panel one time when we ticked through issues. We still disagree on all the issues, but I don't care. And neither does Jacob. We love
Right.
each other
Yeah.
and we can have those conversations because they're done, inside of a relationship. So to me, what Bob has been warning us about all these years, he's been telling us how to do it. And we're here to say, that we've had the experience directly on the ground, and he's right.
Yeah, no, and when you step back and look at it, it makes sense that people would be more inclined to kind of roll up their sleeves and get involved in some sort of project or enterprise that is in their own backyard, so to speak, rather than one that is distant and kind of hard to imagine being able to really affect. And I think there is a sense that people at the local level can feel like, okay, the world may be going to hell in a handbasket, and the rest of the world may be falling apart. But here in our little village, we think we can, do this good thing, and will roll up their sleeves and get after it. But sometimes daunting problems that seem larger than life become much more manageable, and people become much more willing to tackle them and to be drawn in because they know someone that is part of the project and they want to hang out with them, spend time with them, get involved with them in something. So there are a lot of things that I think local communities have going for them that 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 help to build, this sense of goodwill and public trust, even though the reason for gathering may not be that often ends up being a byproduct.
Yeah. It's funny that I think that this is a lesson that I have come to appreciate because it's just right in front of my face and has been for all these years. But I think that, my politics are center left. I think that this is a lesson that's kind of starting to be a new one on the left of American politics. And in some ways, it's really understandable. Like some of the things that have happened at a national level, it meant that, from my center left perspective, a lot of progress could be made all at one time. But maybe we lost some of the point of that bottom up federalism idea that conservatives have advocated um for forever. And if anything, it seems like we've sort of now reversed just a little bit, right?
Yeah, I
Is
mean, some of this in my mind kind of goes back to Jefferson, who interestingly is claimed by people on both sides. I remember, you know, the Democrats, when I was growing up for many years, had, Jefferson Jackson Day dinners and
Mhm.
laid claim to Jefferson. And a lot of folks on the right, will invoke Jefferson today in talking about the importance of limited government and things of that nature. But Jefferson was very much a believer in kind of the government that governs best is the one closest to the people, and that as much as possible, we ought to have decisions made um, closer to the people than, and was obviously wary of too much national power and all the rest. And I do think there's something to be said for, especially in a day like ours, for the concept that different states might choose to tackle problems in very different ways. Either because they disagree on solutions and one thinks that this solution is better than that solution, or because they disagree even on whether there's a problem here. And some will want to do this and others will want to do nothing. And I think that that whole idea of kind of laboratories of democracy and letting there be diversity among the states is helpful because I think it's a good kind of release valve on pressure, and gives people, if Mississippi wants to be Mississippi and Iowa wants to be Iowa and California wants to be California, then so be it. To each his own in a certain sense. I think that sort of idea has a lot of merit, and I think we may be coming increasingly to an appreciation for that as things get shaken up all around us.
Yeah, yeah. I think that I think that's right. I'm hopeful about that. I also, these are I went to a bunch of conferences and I've been reading a lot the past few months, and I just hear over and over and over again, we need to think locally. We need to think locally. And
Mm.
I actually just got off a meeting with Seth Kaplan, who we brought to town, who wrote the book Fragile Neighborhoods. And I wrote down a quote of Seth's. It was, "We've got to intentionally build community in hometowns because it's not happening on its own." And then I wrote down another quote from just the last week. I was listening to the Gray Area podcast, and the guest was Alana Newhouse. And she said, "The trust has broken down all throughout the pyramid of our lives. If we don't have local life in this country that feels generative and enriching and potentially a place of opportunity for people, I think a large part of what we're trying to build on top of that will come apart."
Yeah, no, and I think if you look at some of the survey data that shows that loneliness and people feeling isolated, that those sorts of um, um, problems or attitudes are kind of increasing in our day. Certainly, or we saw this during COVID, that a lot of times I think people felt disconnected. And there's only so much, as great as Zoom and other sorts of new technologies are. There's something about showing up in the flesh and being able to interact with someone in human form and face to face, and being able to, in a certain sense, literally rub shoulders. um yeah, there's something to be said for that, and I think that's why the local community and kind of focusing at a neighborhood level, so to speak, makes an awful lot of sense.
And in the data that we've collected over the years, it what it shows is that remarkably short interventions of gathering people in a positive way across political difference, and talking about we talk about plenty controversial things when we gather, but having something that we do what we do usually around food, and we try to make it enjoyable and entertaining in what you want to do with your evening. That it is remarkable how quickly people change in their levels of affective polarization, in increasing levels of believing in pluralistic norms, respect and understanding, group empathy, etc. That people just move quickly when you provide these kinds of experiences for them. And it's not like any of us think that, one hour conversation does the trick, but if your life is full of faraway digital fury,
Mm.
where it's really easy to boil people down to caricatures of themselves, versus if your life is full of gatherings like that. I mean, I really believe that if you're really talking, if you don't like politics now, if you don't like what's happening to our country, I really believe that ultimately this is how you heal it, is you show up in your community and get to know people that you wouldn't normally know. That is the true, it's clearly long term, but that is the true way to heal what ails us. And I'm curious, am I just drinking my own Kool-Aid? Do you think that too?
Oh no, I think you're absolutely right that the we can easily be led astray by imagining that the sorts of conversations that and really kind of food fights that we see on a lot of political television are kind of representative of how uh, people really are or want to be. I think that a lot the use of the term caricature is a really good one because I think a lot of what we see, I mean, it's intended in some ways to be theater. These are television stations wanting ratings, and so a lot of times the most outrageous person saying the most outrageous thing is what gets the most clicks or the most eyeballs or whatever it is. Um, and that serves a purpose for the folks that are running those stations or podcasts or whatever they might be, that are appealing to that instinct. But I think at a human level, when we go to, live life, that those are not the kind of people that we want to be, not the kind of people that we want to hang with. And I think there need to be other models, and I think the best models are going to be those that are at a human scale, at a human level, in places where we live, beginning from the bottom up. So I'm really glad that you understood from the beginning the importance of local, because I think you're right on.
We know it was accidental, really. In some ways, what I saw that led to the creation of the Village Square was a group of relationships in our hometown across political difference. And we were having, a very angry, politicized conversation about whether to buy into a coal plant locally. That it resulted in, I mean, we were sort of aware there was no place where you could really talk about it, in our community. You could give 3 minutes of testimony to the city or the county commission about how you felt, but there was no real conversation. And I saw this great conversation happening between local leaders who didn't agree at all with each other on the coal plant, but it was inside of the context of a friendship, and it became so obvious that that's what we should be doing, but weren't. And instead, it became like it had kind of stupid, vacuous, dueling ads on TV that cost everyone a lot of money instead of just like, why didn't we talk about this? So in some ways, then that became the model for, okay, it should look like that, right? Which is, you and I, Bill, can disagree on something. And actually, that particular crew of people were kind of funny when they disagreed. I remember one of them, there you go with your commie pinko stuff again. Um, and their relationship could kind of take it.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, but then, the alternative here is if we're so heavily online, what you described about the caricatures of people, a huge percentage of Americans believe that about each other right now, right? We believe the worst, that worst caricature that somebody told us so that we would tune into their network or read their, writing, and we believe it now.
It's certainly a constant temptation that we can fall prey to, and truthfully, I mean, people will often behave in ways that are, um, that just can't be defended and do deserve, our disapproval. And so, um, the I think part of the beauty, and the story you just told is illustrative of this. Part of the beauty of conversations that take place among friends, among people who know each other and who like each other and who think well of each other, even though they disagree, is that I think, will see people maintain perspective and realize that, okay, we we still want to get up tomorrow and be able to call you friend and neighbor and work together in some way. We may never come to a common point on this topic, but there will be something that comes down the road, next week or next month or next year, where we're going to need to work together. And so let's not burn any bridges here, and let's maintain some civility and goodwill toward one another. And I think that's something that, um, again, I think is a lot easier at the local level. You can't, especially in a town the size of Tallahassee, you just can't write people off and burn bridges and alienate folks and expect to kind of, have a rich life long term. And I think that helps because too often, I know from my days in DC, it's real easy to just be able to, kind of lob your grenade in the direction of someone you don't like and never really think again about those people or what they might think.
So interestingly, you're pinging on a principle that I think is another key one to why the solutions are local, and that is the concept of reputational costs.
Mm.
So, we humans, we all humans are motivated by what people think of us, and and it's too easy to behave badly inside of a like-minded group that is growing more extreme in the direction of the majority view, and then just the members in good stead are sort of the people who lob the best grenades
Yeah.
politically.
Well, and
You
you raise a really important point that's kind of the flip side to this, which is that when people live in a community of trust and where they enjoy the opportunity to sometimes have difficult conversations, but to have them with people that know them, trust them, understand them, know them to be people of goodwill, you can then have conversations, um, without fear of stepping on a landmine and getting canceled or getting, kind of
know.
blowing yourself up professionally, because you're able to, have a conversation where someone can say, hey, wait a minute, your terminology, you may not realize this, but it's alienating, it's not helping, could you use a different term or something? But the conversation proceeds. Whereas so often in our cyber world and in our cancel culture, people, I think, often self-censor because they are so fearful of kind of saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing and getting, someone having an idea that they didn't articulate well come out wrong and then having it blow back on them. And again, there's still problems at the local level, at the face-to-face level. There's still conflict, but it's much easier to work out when you've got this, enduring relationship of trust or underlying relationship of trust, rather than just having perfect strangers, often hiding behind, pseudonyms, lobbing
Yeah,
grenades at each other online.
yeah. And inside of a community, of a certain size, um, I mean, this can get to be a little, as a DC kid, I remember the first decade or so that I lived here, I found it very stultifying that I would almost always see someone I know when I went to the grocery store.
Mm.
And in DC, you could go to the same grocery store every day of the year and you'd never see
Yeah.
anyone you knew. Um, and I remember for me it was for whatever reason I always saw the mayor there um, with his kids doing the shopping. And so I learned that I needed to present myself okay enough at Publix that I could go to a meeting with the mayor later and it would be okay. And I think that in some ways our social circles have lost that sense that I really better sort of um, uh, I better restrain myself, present myself in the best way that I can, because I never know if this is going to be a time when, you know, um, if I really burn that bridge, that's gonna come back around in a community of 300,000 like we are. You know?
No question.
And that does help humans behave a little better. Another little human nature thing that I'm fond of, and I don't remember if you and I have ever talked about this, is have you ever heard of Dunbar's number?
I seem to recall you mentioning this to me at some point, but
Yeah,
refresh
so
my memory.
a British anthropologist many years ago started noticing that in human endeavor, he started noticing over and over again the number 150, that people, organizations would organize themselves in groups of 150. And he did his anthropologist thing. And basically his theory, which I buy a little bit, is that humans really are sort of built to have 100, about 150 relationships where we're really in relationship with each other. Um, and that when you start having social systems that are bigger than that, that it doesn't scale well.
Mm.
And you start talking about dynamics between people that become, because of our sort of default settings, they become kind of us versus them, because we're just having trouble with the scale of it all, as human beings. So that by downscaling your relationships to, in some aspect of your life, obviously we live with big systems and lots of things are going to always be a lot of people, but you're sort of back in the range where you can, in a kind of a church environment, that would be the kind of relationships that you would have. You would really know some certain percentage of people, but not even at a mega church, right? A mega church is too big for that. So mega churches kind of downscale by having smaller groups inside of those churches to keep them socially and civically healthy with each other.
Yeah, that's right. And I think there's been a trend away in some respects from the kind of mega church phenomenon in recent years, very likely driven by the kind of thing that you're describing. I'm glad that you refreshed my memory. I'm gonna have to remember it's Dunbar's number.
Dunbar's number.
Yeah,
And, the
that's a
British
really
anthropologist
powerful
Dunbar.
idea, and I do think there's a lot. I want to think about it, but it rings true. That has a lot that it strikes me that explains a lot, especially that notion that when you have systems that are built for much larger groups, that it becomes dehumanizing and people feel alienated. I can absolutely see that.
And when you look at some of the political anger and populism, that in some ways that's what people are saying. If you really dig deep into the substance of it, they're kind of saying help.
Yeah, yeah. It's
Um,
interesting, and I'm just thinking aloud here. Like I work in the education space, and there's been a growing interest in and movement towards smaller schools, micro schools, things of that nature. And I think it's in part driven by this same sort of thing that sometimes people feel like the schools that we have built for students are too large, they're too impersonal, that even though they may be able to offer all kinds of different electives and opportunities that a
mhm.
smaller school might not be able to offer, that in the course of things, the humanity of the kids can, um, the individuality of the student and the kind of personal attention of the student can sometimes be lost. And so, and it strikes me that in a world with smaller and smaller families, um, the need for relatively small institutions around them where people can experience more intimacy may be greater. So anyway, there's a lot here that we can explore in future podcasts, but I definitely want to remember Dunbar's number.
Well, and it strikes me that at this moment in time, when we're trying to figure out what to do, that taking human nature into account is really important. And instead of it all, the thing that's so dangerous and risky is when we decide that it's only half of the population that has all these problems that human beings have, right?
It's all
And
of
it's
us.
not our half,
It's
coincidentally.
all of us.
But if we take this into account and if we say we need to have more small groups in our lives to sort of counter program for the big ways the world is going to keep impinging on us in big ways, right? So yes, that big thing may exist. Yes, the internet is there, but because of how humans are, because we do better when we can reciprocate kindness in person together, when we know people, and when we have reputational costs for misbehavior, then we've got to find spaces that we're growing these things to counteract the challenge that we're in. And the whole point of this first episode of our Flying Pig Academy is it's about local. It is about where you live, where you sleep at night, where you take your boots off, and that we all ought to be paying way more attention to that. And then also just to get a plug in for the basic idea of the village square is what we have learned is that it is so much easier to do this than anybody imagines, and that by gathering people across the community with the intention that we're going to respect each other and know each other, so many of the hard problems are immediately solved. Not all of them. It will never be all of them. But it's the easy way in. And we are, as you know, we've been working to get ready to offer our model to communities across the country. And we're now set up. We have a national website, and we're set up and ready for other communities to do the same thing that we've done. And our experience is that it's not everything, but it's surprisingly easy. And my argument would be that it won't fix everything, but it is a necessary condition of all the things that have to happen. If we are not gathering, like the quote I read, if we are not gathering in hometowns, the things that we build on top of that are not going to hold.
Very well put.
Any closing thoughts from you, Mr. Maddox?
Well, thank you for letting me be a part of this, and I'm looking forward to our future conversations because there's an awful lot of ground. Well, we covered a lot today, but there's an awful lot left to cover of things that we've learned along the way. But
My
you began at the absolute best place because it's if folks don't understand the importance of local, you're you're starting off on the wrong foot.
Yeah, just like the real estate rule, right?
Yeah.
Location, location, location. It really is true. Local, local, local. That
Yeah.
that is where we have to start with all of this, and I'm looking forward to talking about the things we've learned over the years. Some accidental. I tease sometimes that our tagline should be, "We've made the mistakes, so you don't have to." So I'm sure we'll cover some of that in our future conversations.
No doubt.
Thanks for joining us,
Thank
Bill.
you.
It's a pleasure.
All right. Well, this is Corey Nathan, by the way. I was just going to jump right in. It's like I've been sitting there listening to Liz and Bill talk, and I've been wanting to ask questions, and they've been stirring up some thoughts. So I was just ready to dive right in. Anyway, yes, it's Corey Nathan back here with you. I really appreciated this conversation, and I'm so encouraged by the Flying Pig Academy. I'm like a student. I'm sign me up. What's my tuition? Whatever it is. So I I'm so on board. I just want to underscore the theme of what Liz and Bill were talking about here. Right out of the gate, Liz helped to clarify, and I completely agree that the national conversation is getting worse. When we are engaged in these conversations that are national, that whether it's broadcast networks that are putting it out nationally, or podcasts or new media or news, online newspapers or what have you, and then we start to jump in there ourselves, talk to people 3,000 miles away about this one subject, and that's all we're engaging about. That's a national conversation, and we're not good at it. We're only getting worse at it for any number of reasons. But there's an antidote. There's an antidote, and that is when people actually get together locally. I love it. It's because what we're doing is we are, as I think it was Bill who said it, that we get to know people in a multi-dimensional way. We're human beings. We can't be defined by one dimension, one data point, one opinion that we express, one side of a position of one particular issue that we fall on one side or the other on. That is not the totality of our humanity. What When we get together, we're here's what sociologists have been teaching us is that we're storytelling creatures and we're tactile creatures. So as Monty Guzman came back on the program a few weeks ago, reminded us the questions that we ask when we are together are questions that lead folks to tell us about their story because we're storytelling creatures. We are also tactile creatures. So when we're separated by all of this, listen, all the digital technology is great. I use the heck out of it. It's a great way to enhance our human connection. But when we're losing that actual connection, that being among each other, then things only get colder. So this conversation just really struck a chord with me. I've been reading about a political philosopher named Carl Schmitt, who was very influential in the 30s. David French recently wrote one of his opinion pieces about him, and it came up. Catherine Stewart's book just came out this week on the 18th. And she, in her book, Money, Lies, and God, she dealt with some of Schmidt's philosophy. Central to his philosophy was the concept of friend, enemy. If you're not my friend, you're my enemy, and there's nowhere in between. But to the point of what Liz and Bill were talking about, knowing people in a multi-dimensional way. One of my favorite stories in recent years is the friendship of Joe Walsh and Fred Guttenberg. And Joe, I've become friendly with both fellas. Joe is a self-described rabid gun rights activist. Fred tragically lost his daughter in the Parkland shooting. And they had been invited on panels on CNN and MSNBC and Fox, like all different, cable channels, because they were on such opposite sides of this particular heated issue. And what they found after being with each other in person in the green room, getting ready to, fight with each other on air, they found that they actually had a lot in common after the second or third time. And now they've ultimately become very dear friends because what they found, as Liz pointed out too, that there are shared goals, right? The policy positions that they fell on one side or the other on might have been different, but they share values and they share goals. So they ultimately were able to become very dear friends and figure out how to talk about such a heated issue that others haven't been able to talk about. And it's really inspiring. And that's the way it's done. As somebody once told me, the hardest part about working out is putting your shoes on. Similarly, the hardest part about, getting around a soccer field where kids are playing soccer in your neighborhood is getting your shoes on, just getting out there. The hardest part about going to a school board meeting is just putting your shoes on and getting to it. A Chamber of Commerce meeting, just getting to it. Whatever it might be, there's stuff that's happening in so many communities around this country. And the idea is to get around folks, get around our neighbors, be among each other as human beings, not just as someone who feels some way about one issue that you happen to think very differently about. So get among each other, get among our neighbors, remember each other, allow folks to become members all over again in your community. Remember them as opposed to dismember them, right? So put your shoes on, get to those board meetings and city council meetings and Chamber of Commerce meetings, and it really does make a difference. So with that, it is time to close out today. You can tell I was inspired by this talk. So, Yeah, so we'll just close it out there, and please consider joining our members and supporting this programming. You can become a member for just $7 a month or $76 a year, and your business can join for $250. Just go to villagesquare.us/donate to join today. And once you log in, they have this cool pop-up box with the flying pig. They were talking about the flying pig, and that gives you a really easy way to sign up for the newsletter. And that way you can stay up to date with everything happening at the Village Square. Go to villagesquare.us, and so that pop-up box happens, but if you're on the website, you could also scroll down to the bottom for a sign-up box for that newsletter as well. Funding for this program was provided through a grant from Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Florida Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities. We appreciate you listening to this introduction to the Flying Pig Academy. Location, 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 the importance of being local. Not Ernest. Well, Ernest too. The importance of being local. Until next time, we challenge you to reach out with an open heart and mind to someone who doesn't look or think like you. It changes everything. Get around that soccer field. Get to that Chamber of Commerce meeting. Go to that Board of Ed meeting. Anyway, we'll talk to you soon, and thanks so much for listening to Village Squarecast.